Okay, I hope that you watched that 4-minute video on spinal cord anatomy and organization. It will really help you to understand the different pathways going to the brain. So we're going to be talking about the third step in the sensation process, pathways to the brain. So when we're talking about pathways in the nervous system, we're talking about neurons with long axons that connect distant regions in the nervous system. And they call them projection neurons because they're projecting information from one place to another place that's far away. And so only those ones are counted when we're talking about pathways. Okay, and so we will refer to tracts, and a tract is a bundle of axons with the same origin and the common termination. So it's a whole bunch of axons with a whole bunch of neurons that start in the same place and end up in the same place. Okay, so this is one thing that I really love about the somatosensory pathways. They're often named for the origin and termination of the tract that contains the second neuron in the series. So, for example, in one of the somatosensory pathways, the second neuron goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and the neurons that run in that tract are called the Spinolimbic Tract. So it goes from the spine to the thalamus. It tells you where it goes by its name and the direction it goes by its name. So if you had something that was called the Spinocerebellar Tract, you know it's going from the spine to the brain. You know that it's carrying afferent information that's coming from the periphery and going into the central nervous system. So the name on the somatosensory pathways gives you a lot of information, which is awesome. There aren't very many systems in the body that do that, and let's be happy that we have one. So we will talk about different sensory pathways in a minute, but first we're going to review the second step in the sensation experience. So the first step, I'm going to go back one page here. The first step that we talked about in the first section was the sensory neurons, the receptors that are getting information from the periphery. They go to the dorsal root ganglion, which contains those pseudo-unipolar cell bodies. The information goes out the other axon where it synapses with, and we call that receptor neuron the first order neuron. Okay? In the spinal cord, in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, it synapses with the neuron that runs in that tract that's going to take it to where it eventually ends up, and we call that one the second order neuron. Okay? So the second step in the sensory process is sort of the quick one. It's transmitting the information. Okay? So we're going to start to talk now about those bundles of axons, those tracts in the white matter that go to the different regions of the brain. Okay, so there are 3 types of pathways, and we will discuss each one of these in detail, that bring sensory information to the brain. The first one is the conscious relay pathways, and I want you to know these 3 pathways and where they go to and from. From and to, I guess, if you want to say. So the conscious relay pathways, they go from the spine to the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. The divergent pathways, they go from the spine to various areas of the brain and cerebrum, some of them conscious and some of them unconscious. So the conscious relay pathways, it's all conscious. Divergent, some's conscious, some's unconscious. And then the third one is the unconscious relay pathways. Those are all unconscious, and they go from the spine to the cerebellum. So that's going to be proprioceptive information that is handled unconsciously. We're adjusting our posture all the time for our balance and our position in space, but we don't do it on a conscious level. Okay, so An important distinction between the pathways is the fidelity of the information conveyed. And by fidelity, we mean how true is it to what is really happening? What is the discrimination of that information? So information in the conscious relay pathway is transmitted with high fidelity, meaning it's very accurate. It provides very accurate details about the stimulus and its location. These are also known as discriminative sensations. So by discriminative, we mean being able to tell the difference between one sensation and another and one location and another. So that information in the conscious relay pathways is very accurate about the stimulus and its location. It allows us to discriminate between different sensations. Hey, both conscious and unconscious information is relayed in the divergent pathways. And in the unconscious relay pathways, it's all unconscious, proprioceptive, and other movement-related information that goes straight to the cerebellum. So we're not aware of it. Okay? There is a little video on ascending sensory pathways. It's about 3.5 minutes long. If you want to hear it said in a different way, that you can watch that little video. So I have a little chart for each section. Here's a tip for studying for the exam. If I put something in the material in bold, if it's in bold print, that will likely show up on the exam. I'm just saying. Okay, so we're going to talk about the individual pathways and the different tracts that run in those pathways. So the conscious relay pathway, it brings information about the location and the type of stimulus to the cerebral cortex. It's high fidelity information, meaning it transmits accurate details about the stimulus and location. And it's somatotopically arranged, meaning the information in the brain is arranged similarly to actual anatomic arrangement. In other words, there's a section in the brain that is purely dedicated to your left big toe, and if you get a piece of information about your left big toe, like you just stubbed it on a chair, it will go to that area of the brain and only that area of the brain. And this is in a healthy, normal, uninjured nervous system. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that somatotropic arrangement, and or somatotopical arrangement, excuse me, and why it's important. Okay? So there we will talk about each one of these individual little systems and what type of information runs in those tracts. So there's the dorsal column medial lemniscus system, and that conveys discriminative touch and proprioception. So that's being able to tell one thing from another. When you touch something, what is it? So we talk about stereognosis, which is it's the integration of touch and proprioception to identify an object without using vision. So when we use this every day, probably you're digging around in your backpack looking for a pen or looking for your car keys or looking for some change to put in the parking meter because you went downtown, and it's dark in there, you can't see anything, and you're just going by feel. So you're using proprioceptive and touch information to identify objects without actually having to see them. Okay? So we'll talk more about this. So I want you to know the definition of that stereognosis, and it'll come up again later in the class. So the spinothalamic system, it goes from the spine to the thalamus. Okay, the thalamus is what's going to alert the cerebral cortex that here's some information we need to be consciously aware of. The spinothalamic system, it's in the anterolateral columns, and the dorsal column is the dorsal side of the spinal cord, and that's where the discriminative touch and proprioception runs. The spinothalamic system is in the anterolateral column. It transmits discriminative, fast pain, temperature, and coarse touch. So the fast pain, it's that sharp initial pain that you feel that identifies the site of injury right away. You stub your toe and bam, you know that you stubbed your big toe. Right away, you know where that pain is. And those are the A delta fibers. And for some reason, Canvas doesn't let me put in the Greek letters. So they're A delta fibers, they're the fast pain fibers. So they're in between the slowest, those C fibers, and the fastest, those 1, 2, and A beta fibers. Okay? So in order to be aware of sensation, that information must travel to the thalamus for crude awareness. Okay? It has to go through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, and in the cerebral cortex, that's where it is discriminated and you get the fine resolution. That's where you figure out what that sensation is. So the sensory information comes from the periphery, but we only feel things in our brain. We use that information to transmit that into what it really is. Okay? So to be aware of sensation, for crude awareness, the information has to travel to the thalamus. Okay? If it doesn't travel to the thalamus, we are not aware of it. Okay, so that'll be a little more about some of the other pathways. So I'm going to go over with those again. The 3 pathways that bring sensory information to the brain are the conscious relay pathway, the divergent pathway, and the unconscious relay pathway. Okay, now I'm gonna go over the conscious relay pathways again, and then we'll get into the details about the divergent pathways. So the conscious relay pathways, they transmit information to many locations in the brainstem and cerebrum, and they use pathways with varying numbers of neurons. So from the periphery to the brain, it's 3. We had that first order neuron, which is the sensory receptor, the second order neuron, which runs in the tract from the spine to the thalamus, and the third order neuron actually takes the information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. We haven't talked about that yet. But the information in the conscious relay pathways is transmitted with high fidelity, meaning it is very accurate and very localized. Okay? So the information in the conscious relay pathways allows you to make fine distinctions about stimuli. So you know if it's a light touch or if it's pressure. You know if it's on your big toe or on your second toe. It allows you to make those fine distinctions about the stimuli. Okay? So I talked a little about the somatotopic arrangement of information. There's this picture in the book, and I don't know how well it shows up here. Fairly well. It's the little representation of, it's the primary sensory cortex in the cerebral cortex, and the little arms and legs and face and everything, those are called the homunculus. And they are indicating how much of that primary sensory cortex is dedicated to those areas of the body. So you can see there's a lot dedicated to our face and mouth, a lot dedicated to our hands, less dedicated to our lower limb, the jaw, and then these are, I think that is organs. I can't really tell from here. But so it's just a representation of how the areas of the body are represented in the cerebral cortex, in that primary sensory cortex, which we'll talk a lot more about the arrangement of the cerebral cortex later in the course. Okay, so in the primary sensory cortex is part of the cerebrum which discriminates among the size, texture, and shape of objects. So this, there are areas in the cerebral cortex called the somatosensory association areas, and they analyze the information that comes in from those primary sensory areas and the thalamus, and they provide the stereognosis and the memory of the tactile and spatial environment. So the only reason that you can reach in your backpack and grab your keys is because you have seen keys before, you have touched keys before, and you know what they feel like. So the sensory information comes in through your fingers, and it goes up through that first order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron, and goes to the cerebral cortex. And there is where you find the memories and the spatial orientation to know that, yeah, I'm touching keys. These are the keys to my car. The more memory that you have of something, the more finely you can discriminate things. When I was in school, this is my example for this. When I was in school, we were in neuro rehab lab with Jamie, and we were doing, we were testing stereognosis. So what we did is we had a bunch of stuff and we put it inside of something, and we were reaching in and grabbing things and trying to identify them. Well, there was a woman in class who drove a Toyota, and I used to drive a Toyota, and I reached in there and had to identify the item, whatever it was, without looking at it, and I said, "Oh, this is a Toyota key." And she goes, "Wow, you really got that great." That's because my cerebral cortex included a memory of not just what a key feels like, any generic key, but an actual what a Toyota key feels like. I had that information in my cerebral cortex, and so I was able to even more finely discriminate that particular object. So a lot of if you had someone from a culture where they didn't have keys, who had never been exposed to a key and didn't know what one was, they might be able to pick it up and say, well, it's a, without looking at it, it's a tiny light object with one jagged side and one smooth side. It's sort of round on one end and pointy on the other, but they wouldn't have the memory to know that it was a key. Okay, so stereognosis is really tied up not just with the sensory information, but with the sensory association area that is associating that sensory information with previous memories and knowing what things are. So it's a pretty cool little thing. So we talked about the 4 different types of somatosensation: the mechanoreceptor, the thermoreceptors, all those chemical receptors, and the nociception. So all 4 types of those sensations reach conscious awareness via the conscious relay pathways. They travel upward in those 2 routes that we talked about in the spinal cord, the dorsal column and the anterolateral tracts. Okay? So discriminative touch and conscious proprioception. So discriminative touch is the localization of touch and vibration and the ability to discriminate between 2 closely spaced points touching the skin. That's that 2-point discrimination that we tested in lab last summer. Okay? Conscious proprioception is the awareness of the movements and relative position of body parts. So that's that joint position testing that we did with the sensory testing, where you have someone close their eyes and you move their arm up, and you say, is your arm up or down, and they tell you if it's up or down. They have that conscious proprioception, the sense of where their body parts are in space. Okay, so stereognosis, which we talked about with the key, it's the ability to use touch and proprioceptive information to identify an object without vision. Okay, so it's the digging in your backpack sense. That's what I call it in my brain. We'll call it. Okay, so those bits of information run in the conscious relay pathways, and the pathways for discriminative touch and conscious proprioception use a 3-neuron relay. The primary or the first order neuron conveys information from the receptors to the medulla. The secondary or second order neuron conveys information from the medulla to the thalamus, and the tertiary or third order neuron conveys information from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So it's a 3-neuron chain, takes it from your fingertips to your brain. Okay? So there's a one of the figures from the book here that shows the pathway. So one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit is where the different pathways cross over. And where this will start to become important is when we start talking about the spinal system and spinal cord injuries and what things are affected in incomplete spinal cord injuries. So it becomes very important where things cross over, because if you have a spinal cord injury above or below the crossover, it can change where your sensory losses are. So this figure is from page 110 on the book, and it shows the first order neuron going from the periphery to the spinal column. Then it shows it travels up the spinal column and it crosses over in the medulla. So the medulla is in the brain stem. The whole way up the spinal cord, it doesn't cross over till it gets to the medulla. And so that's important because then later on, if we lose that discriminative touch and conscious proprioception, we can tell where the injury is by which side we lose it on. Okay? So the first order neuron goes from the periphery to the medulla, the second order neuron, and in the figure it talks about specifically where the cell body is of the second order neuron. I am not going to, you're not going to have to be responsible for that information, it's just kind of interesting. The second order neuron goes from the medulla to the thalamus, and the third order neuron goes from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So the dorsal column medial lemniscus system is what carries that discriminative touch information. The primary neurons are, there are lots of branches entering the gray matter that contribute to motor control and influence activity in neurons and other sensory systems and influence autonomic regulation. So we're going to talk about all these systems separately throughout the class, but they all do influence each other. So it's crazy. I don't really need you to know where the cell bodies of the secondary neurons are, but just know that the axons cross the midline at the medulla and then ascend to the thalamus. The third order neurons connect the thalamus to the sensory cortex in the cerebral cortex, and they have the axons that are fibers connecting the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so there's another tract that's called the Spinothalamic Tract. It's in the anterolateral white matter. If you watch that spinal cord anatomy video, it describes it really well where it is. It also consists of a 3-neuron relay pathway. So the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway transmits discriminative touch and conscious proprioception. The spinothalamic system, on the other hand, transmits information about pain, temperature, and coarse touch. So those are going to be those A delta fibers. The discriminative touch and conscious proprioceptive information, those are those A beta fibers. Okay? So the functions of the dorsal and anterolateral columns are not rigidly segregated. In other words, a lot of information is coming in. Some of it's running in, some of that conscious information is running in the anterolateral system, some of it's running in the dorsal column, and pain and temperature information can also be in either one. So suffice it to say that it's all conscious information that's running in those two tracts, dorsal column and spinothalamic. And spinothalamic, don't you love that name? It tells you right where it goes from the spine to the thalamus. And it tells you which direction too. It's ascending, it's an afferent information, it's sensory information. Love that stuff. Okay, now we're going to start talking about the divergent pathways. So we're going to go back over to the chart here. The divergent pathways are also called the medial pain system. They transmit to various areas of the brain at stem and cerebrum, conscious and unconscious information. The areas of the cerebrum that it transmits to, they are not somatotopically organized, so they're not very localized. The kind of pain that is transmitted in those divergent pathways in the medial pain system, it's not well localized like the fast pain systems in the anterolateral column. So that's more like that diffuse aching pain. So usually when, like if you stub your toe right away, you feel like, bam, I stubbed my big toe. You know exactly where it is. It's fast. It gets there fast. Later on, the whole foot is throbbing. It's more diffuse. You don't have a localized location of the pain. Okay, so that's why it's not localized, because it's not organized somatotopically like the fast pain system. And they talk about it being the affective dimension of pain, meaning that is the pain that you experience. It's tied up with emotions and with memories, and that's the one that upsets you. If you think of it that way, it's the affective dimension of pain. So it's the free nerve endings, the C fibers, transmit that pain signal to the dorsal root ganglion in the spinal cord. So I use the abbreviation DRG because I don't want to type out dorsal root ganglion a million times. So that those nerves, their soma is in the DRG as well, in the spinal cord. And then they synapse to the medial pain system, and we'll talk about the 3 different tracts, and they go to various areas. Okay, so the Spinomesencephalic Tract. So let's break that word up so we get it. We know spino, we know it starts in the spine from the dorsal root ganglion, goes up through the dorsal horn. And mesencephalic, cephalic is brain, mes is middle. So it goes to the midbrain. It goes to our autonomic systems that are controlled in the midbrain. And what the information that runs up that tract does is it turns your head and eyes towards the source of the pain. It also activates descending tracts from the cerebrum that control pain. So those are some of our endogenous pain control systems, and we are going to talk about that in Chapter 7. And the abbreviation PAG is the periaqueductal gray area. Don't worry about that right now. But just so spinomesencephalic goes from the spine to the midbrain. And its function is to turn the eyes and head towards the source of the pain, and then it activates some of those pain control systems. That's important, right? Okay, so the second tract is the Spinoreticular Tract. So let's break that word down. Spino, you know, it comes from the spine. The reticular activating system, which we'll talk about in detail later on, a very interesting system in the brain. It functions in arousal, attention, and sleep-wake cycles. It's modulated by the reticular formation or reticular activating system. That's why when you are in pain, it keeps you from sleeping, because you have those pain signals going up to your reticular formation, and it's keeping you aroused and attentive, and you can't sleep. Okay? So then the spinolimbic system, same thing, from the spine to the limbic system, and the limbic system functions on a lot of emotion, sensory integration, and personality. So it's slow pain information that goes in the spinolimbic tract, goes through the thalamus, so we're conscious of that. We are not conscious of the information running in the spinomesencephalic tract, because that doesn't, it has to go through the thalamus for us to be conscious of it. We're not conscious of the information running in the spinoreticular tract, but the spinolimbic tract, we are conscious of that, because it goes through the thalamus and then it projects to various areas in the limbic system involving emotion, sensory integration, and personality. So our experiences with pain and our memories of pain and our emotional reaction to pain have a lot to do with how much pain we feel. And we will talk about this more in Chapter 8. It's an amazing thing how much our brain controls our pain level. So the example is you fall and break your leg. You automatically look at the injured area, because the information running in that spinomesencephalic tract turns your head and eyes towards the source of the pain. You're going to look at it, see what happens. Automatic reflexes make you move away from the source of injury. You might faint because of the spinal reticular system sending information to the reticular activating system, and it works on your arousal and attention, so it might arouse you so much that it stimulates a vagal response and you faint. Emotional distress because of the limbic system, and the whole, well, this example says whole hand aching, even though I said break your leg. So let's say you broke your arm, your whole hand aches. Not any specific area, not the area specifically where the break is, but the whole hand, because it's going to lots of different systems, and it's not somatotopically organized. It's not as localized as the conscious relay pathways. Okay? So we're going to just review that because it's complex information. So, divergent pathways, information's transmitted to many locations in the brainstem and cerebrum, and it uses pathways with varying numbers of neurons. So it's not necessarily a 3-neuron chain like in the conscious pathways. So the sensory information is used at both the conscious and the unconscious levels. Aching pain is a form of sensation that goes via the divergent pathways in the central nervous system, and that's the one that goes in the spinolimbic system. That's the one that you are aware of, and that's the one that keeps you awake because it goes in the spinoreticular system as well. Temperature sensation. So we have those specialized free nerve endings of the small myelinated and unmyelinated neurons. So the small myelinated ones are the A deltas, and the unmyelinated are the C fibers. So the A delta fibers carry impulses produced by cooling, and C fibers carry information regarding heat, which for some reason I just think that's fascinating. So cooling is faster. Those A delta fibers are a little faster. Heat's a little bit slower. I don't know what the implications of that are, but I just think it's really kind of interesting. So pain, and we will talk in depth more about pain. Pain is composed of both the sensation and the emotional response to the sensation. So I always tell people in the clinic, and we'll talk more about pain in the clinic and dealing with people in pain, because that is a big part of our job. I always tell people that no one's invented a painometer. We always ask people, like, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And a lot of people have a hard time really localizing it. There's no one thing that we can measure and tell someone, wow, you're in a lot of pain. It's a very subjective thing, because it's composed of the sensation that's happening from our peripheral nerves and then the emotional response to that sensation. So there's a lot going on in our brain when it comes to pain. So the nociceptive neurons, they're receptors that receive or transmit information about stimuli that damage or threaten to damage tissue. So we can have that fast pain that, like, let's just say you got a paper cut. And right away, yikes, that hurts. But then later on, there's not a huge amount of damage to the tissue. You don't generally have a big aching pain after you get a paper cut. It goes away quickly. So that's that fast pain, that spinothalamic pain, initial and immediate sharp sensation that indicates the location of the injury. You got that paper cut, it's right on your thumb, and yikes, that hurts. The slow pain, the spinolimbic pain, is the dull, throbbing ache that follows fast pain and is not well localized. So that's the tissue damage type pain, if that makes sense. So the fast localized pain uses a 3-neuron system. The primary neurons bring information into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, just like a lot of them. Axons of the secondary neurons, they cross the midline right away. They don't wait to get to the medulla like the conscious relay pathways do. So they cross over at that anterior crossover point. If you watched the spinal cord anatomy video, the anterior fissure where they cross the midline. And so they cross the midline to the other side of the spinal cord. They go up the other side to the thalamus. And then the tertiary neurons go from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. Okay? So there's a little diagram You can see in the bottom one, the information's coming in through the dorsal horn. It crosses over immediately. It runs up that anterolateral column, boom, and straight up to the thalamus. Okay? And all of these diagrams are in the book. So when fast pain information reaches the somatosensory cortex, we are consciously aware of a sharp pain in a specific location. So bam, there it is. Because it went through the thalamus, we're aware of it. Conscious awareness. Okay. If tissue damage has occurred, then the fast pain is followed by that slow aching pain. If you didn't really have a lot of tissue damage, the fast pain will dissipate and you won't have that slow aching pain. So that's why I talk about a paper cut, because a lot of times it's a real minor little thing. It's not a huge amount of tissue damage. It's probably not going to result in that slow aching pain. So the onset of slow pain is later than fast pain because the impulses travel on smaller unmyelinated axons. So those C fibers, they're small, they're unmyelinated, they're slow. They're on the slow train. The fast pain is on the express train. The slow pain is on the train that stops at every little town. Okay? So slow pain takes a longer time to get there. So we talk about the medial pain system, and that's the divergent ascending network of neurons that uses several pathways with variable numbers of projection neurons, so it's not a 3-neuron pathway like fast pain. So when we go back and look at that lateral pain system, this is the lateral pain system, we'll look at the medial pain system again, sorry. So it's using several different neurons and several different pathways, not just a 3-neuron pathway. The activity of the medial pain system, that's what elicits the affective, motivational, withdrawal, arousal, and autonomic responses. So those are all those unconscious responses or those emotional responses that can make our pain better or worse. The information is not somatotopically organized, so the slow pain cannot be precisely localized. That's the one where the person goes, well, it's my whole leg sort of hurts, or it's my whole back, or from my back all the way down my leg. It's not precisely localized, other than you got hit right someplace and it's right there. You know exactly where it hurts. So the information that's coming up the medial pain system is affects more the emotional and arousal things. It's the stuff that keeps you up at night. So post-surgically, people often have the fast pain, the immediate pain that they can localize right where it is, and they have the slow pain that keeps them up at night and makes them unmotivated to do things and they want to not use that limb. That's the withdrawal response. And then the various autonomic responses that happen, which we'll talk about later in the autonomic nervous system chapter. So the first neuron in the pain pathway, in that slow pain pathway, is a small unmyelinated C fiber. The receptors are those free nerve endings. They're sensitive to noxious heat, meaning heat that's going to potentially cause tissue damage. Chemical signals that are going to potentially cause tissue damage, or mechanical stimulation that's going to potentially cause tissue damage. So that's the real message on those C fibers, is they are danger receptors. They are damage receptors. They're trying to tell us that we are in trouble. So naturally, we get signals from those receptors and it affects our limbic system. We are going to have an emotional response to that pain. This is danger. We're afraid of it. It causes our pain to be worse. That's very important when we start talking more specifically about pain matrix dysfunction and things like fibromyalgia. So the pain itself has a high threshold in those C fiber endings. So, but with repeated stimulation, they become sensitized. And they can even become sensitized to the point where normal sensations feel like pain. It's a very interesting process. Okay, so that's the first order neuron. Then those synapse with the ascending projection neurons. So those ones go to the midbrain, the reticular formation, and the limbic areas via the Spinomesencephalic Tract, that's spine to midbrain. Spinoreticular Tract, that's the spine to the reticular formation. And the Spinolimbic Tract, that's the spine to the limbic areas, okay? So those tracts, the name of them, they tell you exactly where they go to and from. The tracts are parallel, they're ascending, so they're the afferent sensory information, and only the information in the Spinolimbic Tract is perceived as pain. The Spinomesencephalic Tract, that results in the turning the head and the eyes towards the source of pain. So that's more of an autonomic response. The spinoreticular, that's the one that keeps you up at night. That's the arousal response. And we're not aware of it except for it's keeping us up at night. The spinal limbic system, those are the ones that we perceive as pain. Okay? So the Spinomesencephalic Tract carries nociceptive information, that's that pain, danger, damage information, to those two areas in the brain, which I do not expect you to be aware of. You don't have to remember those names or anything, except just know that the periaqueductal gray area, which I abbreviate as PAG in other places, is part of the descending pain control system, which we'll talk about. So not only does it turn your head and eyes towards the pain, it also starts to activate your descending pain control. So your endogenous pain control systems that work without having to take pain medications or anything like that. And then turning the head and eyes towards the source of noxious input. And activating those descending tracts. That's what that Spinomesencephalic Tract does. The Spinoreticular Tract, they're ascending neurons that synapse in the reticular formation. The reticular formation is a neural network in the brainstem that controls arousal, attention, and sleep-wake cycles. Okay, so that's the one that keeps you up at night. The Spinolimbic Tract, they transmit slow pain information to a couple of nuclei, which you don't need to know specifically those nuclei, in the thalamus. So the thalamus, it's going to become conscious information, and they provide that information that produces automatic movements and emotional responses to the noxious stimuli. So the automatic movements being withdrawing from the pain and then having that emotional response. So the Spinoreticular Tract and the Spinolimbic Tract both affect arousal, withdrawal, autonomic, and affective, meaning emotional, responses to pain. Okay, temperature information, when they say phylogenetically older pathways, it means ones that developed earlier in our evolution. So those are our animal hindbrain. They're in the parts of our brain that developed earlier on. So that's the reticular formation and certain nuclei in the thalamus and subcortical nuclei in the hypothalamus. So those are all things that are controlling unconscious systems in our brain. Okay, so you really don't need to know that phylogenetically older pathways, but temperature information goes in at a very subconscious level. It doesn't, the information that doesn't reach the conscious awareness contributes to arousal, gross localization, like being able to tell where it's warmer and where it's colder, and it contributes to autonomic regulation. So that information is transmitted to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus says, hey, we need to step up some of our hormonal systems to get the body temperature up because it's cold out there. Something like that. So we have that unconscious autonomic response to the temperature information that's being transmitted in those divergent pathways. Okay, so the last pathway that we're going to talk about, the last group of pathways, are the unconscious relay tracts. And yay, there's only one group of tracts in here. But this is the unconscious proprioceptive information and other movement related information that goes right to the cerebellum. Automatic adjustments, the cerebellum makes automatic adjustments to posture and movement. So it compares intended motor output with actual movement output by making corrections to neural commands via connections with other brain areas. So the tracts that carry the unconscious relay information are the Spinocerebellar tracts. We break that word down, it totally makes sense. It goes from the spine to the cerebellum. So there are two tracts that have high fidelity information from muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and cutaneous mechanoreceptors that go to the cerebellum. So those are our nerve endings in our muscles, in our tendons, and in our skin. Those mechanoreceptors in our skin. So there are two tracts that are internal feedback tracts, including spinal reflexes and monitoring the activity of descending motor signals. So there's a lot going on in those spinocerebellar tracts. But it's all going on unconsciously. It's stuff that we do automatically. We don't even think about it. Okay? So we're going to review. I'm going to go over this again just because it helps to get the information in there. The unconscious relay pathways, they relay unconscious proprioceptive and other movement related information straight to the cerebellum. So if I asked you, what area of the brain do the unconscious relay pathways end in? You would say the cerebellum. The information that goes straight to the cerebellum plays the essential role in automatic adjustments of our movement and posture. We don't even have to think about it. It's unconscious. Okay, so they transmit information from proprioceptors and information about activity in spinal interneurons. They relay that information that's critical for adjusting movements. And if you have inadequate proprioceptive input, it can cause ataxia. And ataxia you can sort of think of as incoordination because you don't have the sensory feedback, and that disrupts your movement control. So there are different types of ataxia, which we will talk about. One of them is cerebellar ataxia. Okay, so we have some, in the unconscious relay tracts, we have some high fidelity pathways that relay high fidelity, somatotopically arranged information to the cerebellar cortex. That makes sense, right? Because if the cerebellum is going to do automatic adjustments to our posture, it has to know exactly where that information is coming from. It needs to be able to discriminate, needs highly accurate information, and know exactly what part of the body it's coming from. So the posterior spinocerebellar pathway transmits information from the legs and lower half of the body to the cerebellum. The cuneocerebellar pathway, it goes from the arms and the upper half of the body, and they go through the posterior columns to the lower medulla. So the cuneocerebellar, if you watched that spinal cord anatomy video, that little 4-minute video, right next to the dorsal column, there's that little area that's called the... Oh, I just had a brain fart. Sorry. It's called the cuneate area, right next to the dorsal column. And that's where the information goes from that cuneate area to the cerebellum in that dorsal area of the spinal cord. Okay, the posterior and dorsal mean the same thing, so it travels via the posterior columns to the lower medulla. So later on, when we're talking about spinal cord injuries, we will talk about how those different areas of the spinal cord, if they're affected in an incomplete spinal cord injury, what are the losses in the body. So we also have internal feedback tracts. So we have those two high fidelity pathways, the spinocerebellar pathway, posterior spinocerebellar, and the cuneocerebellar pathway. From the cuneate, which is right next to the dorsal column, in the posterior column. Okay, the internal feedback tracts monitor the activity of spinal interneurons and descending motor signals from the cerebral cortex in the brainstem. So there's the anterior spinocerebellar tract, transmits information from the thoracolumbar spinal cord, and the rostrospinocerebellar tract transmits information from the cervical spinal cord to the same side of the cerebellum. So a lot of the sensory information that goes to the cerebrum crosses over to the opposite side. The information that goes to the cerebellum stays on the same side. So it's interesting. I don't expect you to remember the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the rostrospinocerebellar tract. Just know the Spinocerebellar tract is the one that goes from the spine to the cerebrum, and that's easy because the name tells you what's going on. So information from the spinocerebellar tracts comes from the proprioceptors, spinal interneurons, and descending motor pathways. Information does not reach our conscious awareness because it contributes to automatic movements and postural adjustments. Okay, and the cerebellum is what does those. It's constantly monitoring that information and making tiny little adjustments to make sure we stay upright. Okay, so that's it for Chapter 6. In Chapter 7, we're going to start talking about pain systems and pain control pathways. Really interesting stuff.